What happens when someone plants a seed of hatred so deep that it grows into a forest of determination? What occurs when a teacher's moment of cruelty becomes a student's lifetime motivation? What if the person who tried to destroy your dreams ended up working for the very future they said you'd never achieve? It's October 2003 at Jefferson Middle School in suburban Atlanta. A 13-year-old black boy named Damon Williams sits in his 8th grade English class, quietly working on an essay about his dreams of becoming a teacher. His hand moves carefully across the page as he writes about wanting to help kids like himself from the projects who everyone assumes won't amount to anything. Mrs. Patricia Richardson, a white teacher in her 50s, walks down the aisle, checking on students' work. When she reaches Damon's desk, she stops. She reads over his shoulder, and then she laughs, not the kind of laugh that encourages, but the kind that cuts through hope like a blade through paper. "Damon," she says, loud enough for the entire class to hear, "you want to be a teacher? Honey, let's be realistic. You're just a little Thuggy from the projects. You'll be lucky if you don't end up in prison like your father. Maybe aim for something more appropriate for your kind." The classroom falls silent. 30 pairs of eyes stare at Damon, some with pity, others with the cruel curiosity of adolescents witnessing humiliation. But what Mrs. Richardson doesn't see in that moment is the fire that ignites behind Damon's eyes, not the fire of anger, but the fire of purpose. 20 years later, that same little Thuggy would become Dr. Damon Williams, the youngest school superintendent in Georgia's history. And Mrs. Patricia Richardson? She would find herself sitting across from him in his office, begging to keep her job. This is the story of how one woman's racism became one man's rocket fuel to success. Damon Williams was born in 1990 in the East Lake Meadows housing projects of Atlanta, Georgia, a place that most people knew by its grimmer nickname, Little Vietnam. The complex was notorious for its high crime rates, drug activity, and poverty. But for Damon and his younger sister Kaisha, it was simply home. Their mother, Shanice Williams, worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. She cleaned office buildings at night, worked at a grocery store during the day, and babysat neighborhood children on weekends. Their father, Marcus, had been incarcerated on drug charges when Damon was 9 years old, leaving Shanice to raise 2 children alone in one of Atlanta's most challenging neighborhoods. The early 2000s in East Lake Meadows were defined by systemic neglect and racial segregation. The housing project was 98% black, surrounded by affluent white neighborhoods that might as well have been on different planets. The local elementary school, where Damon attended until 5th grade, was under-resourced and overcrowded with outdated textbooks and insufficient supplies. But Damon was different. While other kids his age were drawn to the streets or resigned to their circumstances, he found refuge in books. His sanctuary was the small library in the community center, where he would spend hours reading everything from science textbooks to biographies of successful people who had overcome poverty. The transformation in Damon's educational journey came when he was selected for a desegregation busing program that transported students from East Lake Meadows to Jefferson Middle School, located in the affluent suburb of Buckhead. The program was designed to provide opportunities for students from underserved communities while promoting racial integration in Atlanta's schools. The transition was jarring. Jefferson Middle School was a world of privilege that Damon had never experienced. Students carried designer backpacks, wore expensive clothes, and talked casually about family vacations to Europe. The building itself was pristine new computers, well-stocked libraries, science labs with equipment that actually worked. But the integration program, while well-intentioned, was deeply flawed in its execution. Research from this period shows that black students in predominantly white schools often faced significant challenges. According to educational studies, black students were disproportionately disciplined, tracked into lower-level courses, and subjected to racial microaggressions from both peers and educators. Damon experienced this discrimination firsthand. Teachers consistently had lower expectations for him and the other black students in the program. He was automatically placed in remedial classes despite scoring above grade level on standardized tests. When he asked to be moved to advanced courses, counselors suggested he focus on being realistic about his abilities. The racial climate at Jefferson Middle School reflected broader patterns of educational discrimination. Studies from this era documented that black students were 3.2 times more likely to be suspended than white students for identical behaviors. Teachers were shown to perceive identical misbehavior as more serious when exhibited by black students, often attributing it to character flaws rather than situational factors. Mrs. Patricia Richardson embodied these biases. A 28-year veteran of the school system, she had taught at Jefferson since it integrated in 1975. She was known among students and parents as a tough teacher who didn't tolerate nonsense. But her definition of nonsense seemed to disproportionately apply to the black students in her classes. Richardson's classroom was decorated with inspirational posters about achievement and success, but her interactions with students revealed deep-seated racial assumptions. She consistently called on black students less frequently, provided less detailed feedback on their work, and made comments that reinforced stereotypes about their communities and families. For Damon, the discrimination was both overt and subtle. Teachers would mispronounce his name despite repeated corrections, assume he was on free lunch without asking, and express surprise when he performed well academically. One teacher told him he was articulate for someone from his background, while another suggested he consider vocational training instead of college prep courses. But it was Mrs. Richardson who would deliver the blow that would define Damon's trajectory. Her comment about him being a thuggy wasn't just a moment of casual racism. It was an assault on his dreams, his dignity, and his potential. It was the kind of comment that was supposed to teach him his place, to make him accept the limitations that society had predetermined for him. What she didn't understand was that Damon Williams had been raised by a mother who taught him that other people's limitations were not his own. The essay assignment that would change everything was supposed to be simple. Write about your future career goals and explain why this profession interests you. Mrs. Richardson had given her 8th grade English class a week to complete the 3-page paper, emphasizing that she wanted to see realistic aspirations and thoughtful analysis of career paths. For Damon Williams, the assignment was an opportunity to articulate something he had been thinking about for months. He wanted to be a teacher specifically, a teacher who would work with kids from backgrounds like his own. He had seen firsthand how good teachers could change lives, and he had also seen how bad teachers could crush spirits. Damon spent 3 days crafting his essay, writing about his vision of creating classrooms where every student felt valued, regardless of their zip code or family income. He wrote about wanting to be the kind of teacher who saw potential instead of problems, who asked, "How can I help you succeed?" instead of, "Why can't you keep up?" The essay was deeply personal. Damon wrote about watching his mother work multiple jobs to support their family, about his father's incarceration and the shame he felt about it, and about the teachers at his elementary school who had believed in him despite his circumstances. He wrote about his dream of one day returning to Eastlake Meadows as an educator, bringing resources and hope to a community that had been written off by society. On the morning of October 15, 2003, students submitted their essays at the beginning of class. Mrs. Richardson announced that she would be reading selected papers aloud and providing feedback to help students improve their writing. She had done this before, usually choosing papers that either exemplified excellent work or contained errors that could serve as teaching moments. Damon felt confident about his essay. He had proofread it multiple times, checked his grammar, and ensured that his arguments were well supported. His mother had even helped him review it the night before, telling him how proud she was of his thoughtful writing and ambitious goals. Mrs. Richardson began the class by reading several student essays. She praised Jennifer Morrison's essay about becoming a veterinarian, noting her realistic understanding of the educational requirements. She commended Tyler Brooks's paper about pursuing engineering, commenting on his appropriate career choice, giving his strong math skills. Then she picked up Damon's essay. "Class, I want to read you an example of what happens when students don't think realistically about their futures," she announced, holding up Damon's paper. "This student has written about wanting to become a teacher, but I think we need to have an honest conversation about appropriate expectations." Damon felt his stomach drop. He could sense what was coming, but he couldn't believe it was actually happening. Mrs. Richardson began reading excerpts from his essay, but not in the way he had written them. She emphasized certain phrases with a mocking tone, pausing dramatically after sentences about his background and his dreams. When she reached the section where he wrote about wanting to help underprivileged students, she stopped reading entirely. "You see, class," she said, setting the paper down and looking directly at Damon. "This is what happens when students don't understand their place in the world. Damon, honey, you're just a little Thuggy from the projects. You'll be lucky if you don't end up in prison like your father. Teaching requires education, sophistication, and respect, qualities that, frankly, people from your background just don't have. Maybe you should aim for something more appropriate for your kind, perhaps maintenance work or fast food management." The classroom erupted in a mixture of gasps, nervous laughter, and uncomfortable silence. Some students looked shocked, others seemed entertained by the spectacle, and a few appeared genuinely disturbed by what they had witnessed. Damon felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath him. The word "thuggy" hit him like a physical blow, not just because it was racist, but because it was meant to reduce him to nothing more than a stereotype Mrs. Richardson had taken his most heartfelt aspirations and used them as a weapon against him. But what hurt even more was the reference to his father. Damon had been vulnerable in his essay, writing honestly about his family struggles and his determination to break cycles of poverty and incarceration. Mrs. Richardson had taken that vulnerability and weaponized it, using his father's mistakes as evidence that Damon was destined for failure. The other students' reactions were almost as painful as Mrs. Richardson's words. Some laughed because they were uncomfortable and didn't know how else to respond. Others laughed because they agreed with the teacher's assessment. A few looked sympathetic, but none spoke up in Damon's defense. Damon remained silent during the incident, but his mind was racing. He thought about his mother working 3 jobs to give him opportunities. He thought about his elementary school teachers who had encouraged him to dream big. He thought about the community center library where he had read biographies of people who had overcome far greater obstacles than the ones he faced. After class, Damon approached Mrs. Richardson's desk, hoping she would apologize or explain that her comments had been some kind of misunderstanding. Instead, she doubled down. "Damon, I hope you understand that I'm trying to help you," she said, not looking up from the paper she was grading. "It's better to learn these lessons now than to set yourself up for disappointment later. People like you need to be realistic about what's possible. Focus on trades or manual labor. There's nothing wrong with that kind of work." That evening, Damon went home to the small apartment he shared with his mother and sister. He told Shanice what had happened, watching as her face moved through a series of emotions: shock, anger, sadness, and finally, determination. "Baby," she said, pulling him close, "that woman doesn't know who you are or what you're capable of. She doesn't get to define your future. Nobody does except you." But the damage was done. Word of the incident spread quickly through the school. Other students began calling Damon Thuggy in the hallways. Some teachers seemed to view him differently, as if Mrs. Richardson's assessment had confirmed their own biases. Damon's confidence was shaken, and for the first time in his life, he began to doubt whether his dreams were really achievable. The incident occurred during a period when racial discrimination in schools was well documented, but often ignored. Studies showed that black students regularly faced lower expectations, harsher discipline, and negative stereotyping from educators. But rarely were these biases expressed as explicitly as Mrs. Richardson had expressed them. What Mrs. Richardson couldn't have known was that her attempt to crush Damon's spirit would have the opposite effect. Instead of accepting her limitations, he would use her words as fuel for a fire that would burn for the next 20 years, driving him to prove that a little Thuggy from the projects could achieve anything he set his mind to. The weeks following, Mrs. Richardson's humiliation were among the darkest of Damon Williams's young life. The incident had shifted something fundamental in how he moved through Jefferson Middle School. Where he had once walked with confidence, he now found himself questioning every interaction, wondering if other teachers and students saw him the way Mrs. Richardson did, as nothing more than a stereotype, waiting to fulfill society's lowest expectations. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Research shows that when black students experience racial discrimination from teachers, they often internalize negative messages about their abilities and potential. Damon began to experience what psychologists call stereotype threat, the fear of confirming negative stereotypes about his racial group, which actually impaired his academic performance. His grades began to slip, not because he was less capable, but because the constant stress of navigating a hostile environment was exhausting. He found himself second-guessing answers he knew were correct, hesitating to participate in class discussions, and avoiding eye contact with teachers who might interpret his engagement as threatening or inappropriate. The social consequences were equally brutal. Students had begun using Thuggy as a nickname for Damon, turning Mrs. Richardson's racist comment into a daily reminder of his supposed inferiority. During lunch, he often sat alone, no longer confident enough to join conversations or make new friends. The other black students in the integration program were facing their own challenges and couldn't provide the support he needed at home. Shanice Williams watched her son transform from an optimistic, ambitious teenager into someone who seemed defeated and withdrawn. She knew that the education system had failed him in the most fundamental way possible, not by providing inadequate resources, but by attacking his sense of self-worth and possibility. Damon, she told him one evening as they sat at their small kitchen table, I see what that woman's words are doing to you, but I need you to understand something. Her ignorance doesn't get to define your intelligence. Her limitations don't get to become your limitations. But Shanice also knew that moral support alone wouldn't be enough. She began researching everything she could about educational rights, racial discrimination, and pathways to success for black students. She contacted the NAACP, spoke with other parents in similar situations, and learned about the systemic nature of the challenges Damon was facing. The turning point came when Shanice connected with Dr. Angela Davis, a black educational psychologist who specialized in helping students overcome racial trauma in academic settings. Dr. Davis explained to both Shanice and Damon that what he had experienced was not just personal cruelty, but part of a larger pattern of institutional racism that was designed to limit the aspirations of black students. Damon, Dr. Davis told him during their first session, Mrs. Richardson's words were meant to plant seeds of doubt in your mind. But here's what she doesn't understand. Every successful black person in America has had someone tell them they weren't good enough, smart enough, or worthy enough. The question isn't whether you'll face racism. The question is how you'll respond to it. Dr. Davis introduced Damon to the concept of oppositional culture, the idea that marginalized, Groups can use discrimination as motivation rather than limitation. She showed him biographies of successful black educators like Mary McLeod Bethune, who founded what would become Bethune-Cookman University, despite facing far worse racism than anything Damon had experienced. Slowly, Damon began to reframe his experience. Instead of seeing Mrs. Richardson's comment as evidence of his limitations, he began to see it as evidence of the broken system he wanted to help fix. Instead of accepting that he didn't belong in education, he became determined to transform education so that no other child would experience what he had experienced. The academic recovery was gradual but determined. Damon began studying harder than ever before, not to prove Mrs. Richardson wrong, though that was certainly a motivating factor, but to prove to himself that his dreams were valid and achievable. He joined the debate team, where his passion for education and social justice became evident to coaches and teammates not by high school. Damon's academic performance had not only recovered, but exceeded his previous levels. He earned a 4.2 GPA, scored in the 95th percentile on the SAT, and was accepted to several prestigious universities with full scholarships. But more importantly, he had developed a clear understanding of his life's mission, to become the kind of educator who would never allow a student to be diminished because of their background. Throughout this period, Mrs. Richardson continued teaching at Jefferson Middle School, seemingly unaware of or indifferent to the impact her words had had on Damon's life. She continued to exhibit the same racial biases with other students, contributing to the school's persistent achievement gaps and disciplinary disparities. Other families began to complain about Mrs. Richardson's treatment of black students, but the school administration was reluctant to take action against a tenured teacher with nearly 3 decades of experience. The complaints were filed away, dismissed as misunderstandings or oversensitivity, allowing the discrimination to continue unchecked. During his senior year of high school, Damon was invited to speak at a Black History Month assembly at Jefferson Middle School. As he stood at the podium looking out at the auditorium full of students, including many who looked like him and faced similar challenges, he saw Mrs. Richardson sitting in the back of the room. 5 years ago, he told the assembled students, a teacher in this school told me that I was just a thuggy who would never amount to anything. She said I should aim for something more appropriate for my kind. Today, I'm here to tell you that other people's limitations are not your limitations. Other people's prejudices are not prophecies about your future. Mrs. Richardson left the assembly early, but Damon's message had been delivered. He was no longer the broken 13-year-old who had doubted his own worth. He was a young man with a mission, and that mission would ultimately lead him back to Jefferson Middle School, not as a victim, but as the person in charge. 20 years after Mrs. Richardson called him a thuggy, Dr. Damon Williams sat in his office on the top floor of the Jefferson County School District headquarters, reviewing personnel files for teachers whose contracts were up for renewal. At 33, he was the youngest superintendent in Georgia's history, having earned his doctoral degree in educational leadership from Harvard and transformed 3 struggling school districts during his meteoric rise through the ranks. Irony wasn't lost on him that he was now responsible for overseeing the very school where he had been humiliated as a 13-year-old. When the school board had offered him the superintendency, his first instinct had been to decline. He had successful programs running in other districts, and returning to Jefferson County felt like opening old wounds. But then he thought about all the students who were currently sitting in classrooms, facing the same kind of discrimination he had experienced. He thought about the teachers who were probably telling black and brown children that their dreams were unrealistic or inappropriate for their kind. He realized that his appointment wasn't just a career opportunity. It was a chance to heal the very system that had tried to break him. His first year as superintendent had been transformative. He implemented comprehensive bias training for all teachers, established mentorship programs for students from underserved communities, and created clear consequences for educators who exhibited discriminatory behavior. Test scores rose, achievement gaps narrowed, and complaints about racial discrimination dropped significantly. But there was one piece of unfinished business that had been weighing on his mind. Mrs. Patricia Richardson, now 57 years old. Richardson was still teaching 8th grade English at Jefferson Middle School. Her personnel file told a troubling story. Dozens of complaints from parents over the years, allegations of racial bias in grading and discipline, and consistently lower performance from students of color in her classes. Previous administrators had ignored these patterns, but Dr. Williams couldn't. The meeting was scheduled for 3:30 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. Dr. Williams had reviewed Richardson's file thoroughly and had documentation dating back 15 years, showing a pattern of discriminatory behavior that had somehow never resulted in meaningful consequences. When Richardson entered his office, she clearly didn't recognize him. 2 decades had passed, and the confident man in the tailored suit bore little resemblance to the quiet 13-year-old she had humiliated. "Mrs. Richardson," Dr. Williams said, gesturing for her to take a seat across from his desk. "Thank you for coming in. I wanted to discuss some concerns that have been raised about your classroom practices and overall approach to student development." Richardson's posture was defensive from the start. "Dr. Williams, if this is about those complaints from last semester, I can explain. Some parents just don't want to hear the truth about their children's limitations. I've been teaching for over 30 years, and I know how to identify students who have realistic potential versus those who need to adjust their expectations." The words hit Dr. Williams like an echo from the past. Even after all these years, Richardson was still peddling the same racist philosophy that had nearly destroyed his self-confidence. "Mrs. Richardson," he said calmly, "I'd like you to tell me about a student you taught in October 2003. His name was Damon Williams. He wrote an essay about wanting to become a teacher." Richardson's face showed no recognition. "Dr. Williams, I've taught thousands of students over the years. I can't be expected to remember every single one of them. Perhaps this will refresh your memory," Dr. Williams continued, pulling out a manila folder. "You called him a little thuggy from the projects and told him he would be lucky if he didn't end up in prison like his father. You said teaching required qualities that people from his background just don't have." The color drained from Richardson's face as the memory came flooding back. Her eyes widened as she looked more closely at the man sitting across from her, finally seeing the resemblance to the boy she had tried to crush. "You double quotes," she whispered. "You're that student." "I am," Dr. Williams confirmed. "I'm that little thuggy you said would never amount to anything. I'm the boy you told to aim for something more appropriate for my kind. And now, Mrs. Richardson, I'm your boss." The silence in the room was deafening. Richardson's hands trembled as she realized the full magnitude of the situation. The student she had dismissed and demeaned was now in a position to determine her professional future. "Dr. Williams," she began, her voice shaking, I don't remember it happening exactly that way. I was probably just trying to help you be realistic about Mrs. Richardson," Dr. Williams interrupted. "I have 47 documented complaints about your treatment of students over the past 15 years. 31 of those complaints involve allegations of racial bias. Your students of color consistently underperform compared to students in other teachers' classes, even when controlling for socioeconomic factors." He paused, letting the weight of the evidence settle in the room. "The boy you tried to break became the man who's going to fix this system. And that starts with ensuring that teachers who can't see the potential in all students no longer have the privilege of crushing dreams." The conversation that followed would become legendary in educational circles, though the details would only emerge years later. Mrs. Patricia Richardson found herself face to face with the living embodiment of her own prejudice, forced to confront the damage she had inflicted not just on Damon Williams, but on countless other students over her 3-decade career. Dr. Williams offered Richardson a choice: immediate termination for cause, which would end her career in disgrace and jeopardize her pension, or early retirement with the agreement to participate in a comprehensive racial bias awareness program that would be filmed and used to train other educators. The sessions would be led by Dr. Williams himself, creating what he called a learning opportunity for everyone involved. Richardson chose the latter option, and the video series that resulted became a powerful tool for addressing educational racism. In the sessions, Richardson was forced to confront specific incidents from her past, including her treatment of Damon and other students of color. The process was uncomfortable and often emotional, but it produced genuine insights about how unconscious bias could destroy young lives. "I never thought of myself as racist," Richardson said in one particularly powerful moment captured on camera. "I thought I was being helpful, preparing students for reality. But I realize now that I was creating limitations that didn't exist and calling them reality." The broader impact of Dr. Williams's superintendency extended far beyond one teacher's accountability. Under his leadership, Jefferson County Schools became a model district for educational equity. Achievement gaps that had persisted for decades began to close as teachers learned to recognize and address their own biases. Dr. Williams implemented several innovative programs that gained national attention. The Dream Big initiative paired successful professionals from diverse backgrounds with students who showed academic potential but faced socioeconomic challenges. The Voice and Choice program gave students platforms to share their experiences with discrimination and helped administrators address problems before they escalated. Perhaps most importantly, Dr. Williams established the Damon Williams Center for Educational Excellence, a research and training institute focused on eliminating racial bias in schools. The center developed curriculum, trained educators, and conducted research that influenced policy at state and national levels. The transformation wasn't just statistical, it was cultural. Students who had previously felt marginalized began to thrive. Parents who had lost faith in the system began to re-engage. Teachers who had unconsciously perpetuated discrimination learned to become advocates for all their students. Mrs. Richardson's story became a powerful component of the center's training programs. Her willingness to acknowledge her mistakes and participate in the bias awareness sessions made her a surprisingly effective advocate for change. She spent her retirement years speaking at education conferences, sharing her story as a cautionary tale about the real-world impact of racial assumptions. "I spent 30 years in education, thinking I was helping students by managing their expectations," she would tell audiences. "What I was actually doing was limiting their possibilities based on my own prejudices." Dr. Williams taught me that our job as educators isn't to predict what students can achieve. It's to help them achieve more than they thought possible. The ripple effects of Dr. Williams's work extended throughout Georgia and beyond. Other school districts began implementing similar programs, and several states adopted policies based on research conducted at the Williams Center. The model demonstrated that addressing educational racism wasn't just morally right, it was also economically beneficial. As more students achieved their potential and contributed to their communities, by 2020, Jefferson County Schools had become one of the most equitable districts in the nation. The achievement gap between black and white students had been virtually eliminated. Graduation rates had increased by 23%, and college enrollment among students of color had doubled. Dr. Williams often reflected on the journey from that painful day in Mrs. Richardson's classroom to his position as a national leader in educational reform. He would tell audiences that Mrs. Richardson's cruelty had actually been a gift, not because racism was acceptable, but because it had crystallized his understanding of what needed to change in American education. She tried to teach me my place. He would say, but instead, she taught me that some places need to be changed. She wanted me to accept limitations, but she actually showed me exactly what I needed to fight against. The story of Damon Williams and Patricia Richardson became required reading in education programs across the country, serving as both a warning about the destructive power of racial bias and a testament to the transformative potential of resilience. And determination. The story of Dr. Damon Williams reminds us that words have power, the power to wound and the power to heal, the power to limit and the power to liberate. When Mrs. Richardson called that 13-year-old boy a Thuggy, she intended to teach him his place in a world that had predetermined his failure. Instead, she ignited a fire that would burn for 20 years and ultimately transform an entire school system. But this story isn't just about one man's triumph over racism. It's about the countless children who sit in classrooms today, facing teachers who can't see past their preconceptions. Research shows that black students are still disciplined more harshly, tracked into lower-level courses more frequently, and subjected to lower expectations than their white peers. The systems that tried to limit Damon Williams are still limiting other young people. Right now. Mrs. Richardson's transformation reminds us that people can change, but only when they're forced to confront the reality of their actions. Her willingness to acknowledge her mistakes and work toward redemption shows that even those who perpetuate harm can become part of the solution. The most powerful lesson from this story is that other people's limitations are not your own. When someone tells you that you don't belong, that you're not smart enough, that you should aim lower, they're revealing their own limitations, not yours. They're showing you the boundaries of their imagination, not the boundaries of your potential. Every day, in schools across America, there are young people who need to hear Damon Williams's message. Your dreams are valid. Your potential is unlimited. And the person who tries to crush your spirit today might someday find themselves asking for your mercy. The question isn't whether you'll face discrimination. It's how you'll transform that discrimination into determination. It's how you'll turn someone else's hatred into your own fuel for success. Your future is not determined by their prejudice. It's determined by your persistence.